Hey guys, happy Wednesday and welcome back to We're Fucked Until We're Not, a podcast talking about all things climate change and sustainability for 15 minutes or less. Environmental education, to me, has been lacking a lot of realism, and while I love the optimism surrounding it, I think there's just been a bit too much flowery talk, and we need to be straight up about the problems and solutions, and that's what I'm here for. I'm your host, Mehul, and I'll be doing this every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern. This is actually last week's episode, so if you want episodes that are a week early and ad-free, then check out the Patreon that I linked in the description below. There's ad-free episodes, bonus segments, and so much more. And before we go ahead, also feel free to give me a follow on any of the podcast social media channels. It's on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. But if you aren't that active on social media and still want to reach out, then shoot the podcast an email. I'll put all of the links in the description below. Now let's get into it. This week we'll be talking about climate change and various diseases that it's associated with. I know you're probably so sick of talking about viruses after the year we've had, but this is all really important stuff to know going forward. Climate change and disease sound like two things that aren't related at all, but actually, as the effects of the climate crisis worsen, viruses and other diseases as a whole are things that we're gonna have to worry about sooner rather than later. In the past year, COVID-19 has shown at least most of you how ridiculously unprepared we are for a pandemic as a society. Every major country on the planet would not stop talking about how developing countries aren't prepared for a pandemic because of their crowded villages and their lack of resources. But look at the United States. Look at Italy. You have developed countries losing hundreds of thousands of people to a disease with a relatively low mortality rate. Had COVID-19 been an even more dangerous disease than it is already, these countries would have lost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Pandemics like these seem like a once-in-a-century thing, but now is the time for countries around the world to take a good, hard look at their pandemic readiness infrastructure and change it as soon as possible. And that's because, unfortunately, COVID-19 isn't going to be the first disease that'll travel across the world, and there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not even the first new disease to spread around recently. Every few years, it seems like there's a new one on the news, right? There's Zika, Ebola, the swine flu, just always a new one out almost every year. And that's not really the media's fault. Over the past 30 years or so, the number of diseases emerging every year has increased dramatically to the point where there's about 5 new diseases emerging per year. The good news is that most of them have been somewhat harmless or haven't spread too quickly, with COVID being the most recent and obvious exception. Even COVID itself isn't a rarity. There's tons of coronaviruses out there. Bats alone carry 3,200 strains of coronaviruses, and any one of them can jump to humans. Now, this episode isn't about fear-mongering, and I'm not telling you to become a germaphobe or anything like that. But as the effects of climate change show and become progressively worse, the number of emerging diseases is going to increase, and while most are harmless, any one of them could be the one that games like Plague Inc. are based off of. There's a few major reasons as for why and how these emerging diseases are related to climate change. The first is deforestation. Deforestation is the rapid cutting down of forest areas, and it's done for a lot of reasons, but the two main ones are for housing developments and clearing paths for agriculture. Deforestation is a large issue overall, and I'll make a full episode about that later on. All you need to know for right now is that about 1 football field size of forest area is cut down somewhere in the world per second. Rainforests are known for containing a lot of biodiversity, and that includes viruses and bacteria. These viruses and different kinds of bacteria being there was never really an issue because these areas of the forest are remote and away from large developments or farms. But as we cut down more and more of the forest, these previously remote areas are no longer remote. People are living or working near these newly deforested areas. And it's not like the plants and animals and pathogens that were originally there have anywhere else to go. They either die or have to find a way to survive surrounded by completely different conditions. The ones that stay close to people that haven't been in these remote areas before are the ones that pose a danger. About 3/5 of all new diseases come from animals or zootonic disease, which means it's a disease that spreads from animals to humans. And 1/3 of those are directly related to changes in land use that are man-made, like deforestation. So that 1 football field per second stat comes in now because with this much pressure and this much contact with animals that are there, it's almost a ticking time bomb. Now again, most diseases that come out are harmless, but it doesn't mean that we should wait for the one that makes COVID look like a nice Saturday morning. The second is with permafrost. As the name suggests, permafrost is a frozen layer of ice in the north and south poles that stays frozen throughout the year and contains a lot of frozen prehistoric or recent organic material like plants or pathogens. And this permafrost stayed frozen for tens or hundreds or thousands of years in some cases, and that means it has some old stuff in there that we aren't too familiar with. The cool thing is that since perma is in the name, it'll stay permanently frozen, right? Unfortunately, that's not how it's going right now. Because of rapidly rising temperatures, this permafrost is melting. Economists are loving all the ice melting because it thinks it'll clean up shipping routes, but this permafrost is letting a lot of things out when it melts. On one end, it's releasing stored carbon and methane, and that's for a later episode, but it's also letting these pathogens out as it melts. Now, this seems like some kind of faraway scenario, but here at the WF Podcast, we know that most of these quote-unquote faraway scenarios are happening and have happened. An example of this is also true in Siberia in 2016. A huge heat wave hit the area that summer, which melted some of the permafrost in the area. Now, back in the 1940s, there was an outbreak of anthrax in the area, and many reindeer lost their lives thanks to it. One of these reindeer's carcass stayed frozen in the tundra's permafrost until that heat wave in 2016. So part of that melting permafrost included that reindeer, and the bacteria that was dormant inside of it was released, resulting in thousands of reindeer losing their lives. This also hospitalized and even killed human beings in the area, so these diseases are definitely not just limited to animals. Rightly so, this was called a zombie outbreak, and this is just going to be something that keeps popping up as more and more permafrost melts. Anthrax is still a threat that's out there as livestock in permafrost from the 18th and 19th century are melting, but as older permafrost thaws, there's a whole host of dormant bacteria and viruses that could spread at any moment, and one of them can be the one that scientists have been warning us and worried about. And as climate change gets worse, it's only accelerating the melting of this permafrost, so we really need to be prepared. I'll talk about the third way climate change can impact diseases in just a second. While we're on the topic of sponsorships, 20% of all proceeds from the month of March will be going to a mutual fund organization based in California called Community Got Us. Back to viruses though. So we already know about two ways that viruses or other diseases can emerge, but the way they can emerge and spread is also getting worse. Mosquitoes and ticks are responsible for spreading a lot of diseases like Zika, Lyme disease, the West Nile virus, and many more. But because of how climate change is warming weather and changing weather patterns, including affecting precipitation, the geographic area in which these mosquitoes and ticks and other kinds of insects can thrive in is expanding, which means that they can spread these to a larger and larger group of people. This means that not only are they a threat for new viruses, but they can also spread them incredibly fast as well. This means that even outside of decreasing emissions, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to prepare. If there's any silver lining to what the past year or so has given us, it's that countries actually have a chance to prepare themselves better for a pandemic. And I'm not minimizing COVID in any way, but the next one can be even worse. But by then, hopefully we'll be ready to face it and we'll fare a lot better than we did with COVID-19. I know this episode was kind of heavy, so I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. And if you want more resources, information, or you fall in love with the sound of my voice, I've linked all of the podcast socials in the link below as well as its email. If you want more access to resources and want episodes a week early, then once again, check out the podcast Patreon and there's a lot of cool stuff there. I'll see you guys next Wednesday.